Welcome everybody. Looks like a really big turnout. Thank you for that. This is the next in ARC series of informational webinars, and each time we pick a topic that's relevant. It reflects the changing landscape of the world that we're working in. And today we're going to talk about the changing climate in residential fire risk assessments. I think there's a general feeling that certainly amongst our clients that risk assessments are ever changing. So what we're going to do today is look a little bit at why that might be. We're going to focus on a little bit of the law that's leading that, if you like. David, if you don't mind moving on, I'll introduce us now. I'm Peter Clark. I'm the Executive Director at ARC Workplace Risk. I've worked in safety in the built environment for the past 20 or so years, 5 of those with ARC, and as I say, I'm now the Executive Director. And my colleague David Hills will be taking you through much of this presentation. David is our Senior Director for Regulatory, Technical and Technology Solutions. David's been working at ARC for most of ARC's existence, I think. So he over 24 years. Wow. Okay, thank you for that, David. And David comes from a position of safety and residential structure, etc. So a member of RICS, etc. So brings with him a lot of insight. ARC as an organisation, before we kind of get into this, I think we need to talk a little bit about us and where we came from. So many of you will know us anyway, but it's worth reflecting on the fact that we've been in existence now this year for 30 years, which is a wonderful achievement for us all. That 30 years has been spent predominantly in the built environment. We've made it our niche, and we've made it our mission to understand and work with clients in the built environment, in the residential property sector, in the commercial property sector. And I think 30 years experience gives us a permission to be at the table when we start to talk about things like fire risk assessments. We've lived and breathed it for so long now. We work with some incredible clients, over 500 clients around the UK, across Europe and in North America as well. And that number is growing as we grow. We also work, you see the logos at the bottom there, we work with our friends and colleagues in the industry organisations such as the ARL, used to be called the UKAA, the TPI, Building Safety Alliance. We are constantly doing this type of thing with them as well. One of the missions at ARC is to take our expertise back to our marketplace and share our knowledge. Thanks, Dave. If you move on, we'll look at what we're going to talk through today. It's a cultural shift, so we look at how that culture has changed and how it needs to change and continue to change. We're going to look at how we got to where we are today and the two regimes that are potentially conflicting and potentially harmonious, but we'll talk through those. The impact of Section 156, this is hugely important. Section 156 of the Building Safety Act 2022 is hugely important. It refers to the way that we conduct fire risk assessments, the way you should procure fire risk assessments. We'll look at the impact on high-risk buildings and the safety case reports. The FRA feeds into those things and is a crucial part of a safety case report. We'll look at the different types of fire risk assessment, the management of risk, the prescribed principles prescribed by the government in this new law. We'll look at the consequences and the outcome of all of this. We're going to draw some conclusions, and then we're going to have some time at the end, hopefully, for some questions. So my colleague Rhiannon is with us today. We're going to do a poll just before we start. We're going to do a poll, and Rhiannon, if you can go on to that. We'll do a poll now, and then we're going to do a similar poll towards the end. Over to you, Rhiannon, for that one.
So you should have had a little pop-up. If not, you can see it in the chat where you should be able to submit your answers for the poll. And we'll give everyone a couple minutes to answer, and then we will feedback on that in a second.
Brilliant. You can see those responses coming in. So this is just about the type of fire risk assessment that you're used to. You're used to procuring a risk assessment for your building. This essentially covers those different types of risk assessment we're going to come on to later on, but it's very interesting for us as a business to see what's out there in the market and what people are currently doing.
Okay, I shall just close the poll just now. It seems like most people have got their answers in, and I will share the results with you just now. So we've got 38% of you have carried out an assessment that only covers the common areas of the building in an unintrusive manner. We've got 9% have covered the common areas of the building, but only included a small degree of intrusive investigation. 40% of people have done an assessment that covers the common areas of the building and a sample to the tenant's demised area, undertaken in an unintrusive manner. And then we've got 13% of people who have done an assessment that covers the common areas and a sample of the tenant's demised areas, but includes a degree of intrusive investigation.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Rhiannon. That tells us a thing, and there's no surprises here from my perspective anyway. I think we're looking at 1 and 3 there, and these are, no surprise to you, all the different types of fire risk assessment. So the 1 there, the non-intrusive, just the common areas. There's some startling statistics about fire in properties, residential properties, and that statistic I'm going to pass over to David in a moment to talk you through, but what it's essentially going to tell you is that those common areas are your least of our concerns when we're conducting fire risk assessment. So it's a very interesting poll. We'll do one right at the end as well, but for the time being I'm going to hand over to my colleague David now, take us through the rest of the presentation. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Rhiannon. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the rest of the presentation and just really focus on how we got to where we are, where the law is, and talk specifically about the types of assessment, and then talk specifically about the management principles or prescribed principles, which really set out how we now need to think about fire risk assessments. And whilst we're focusing in on residential accommodation, there are going to be other areas as well that we need to be able to consider, especially when it comes to Section 156. So I'm just going to start straight away then. So the Building Safety Act has introduced that new framework for managing safety, but managing safety specifically for higher risk residential buildings. And there's very clearly a growing emphasis on looking after and considering, when it comes to risk assessments, for example, the whole building and all of the occupants, not just the occupants that you are particularly responsible for or the areas for which you are particularly responsible for. We have to consider the entirety of the building. And the regulations themselves are all aimed now at preventing the incidents from initially occurring, from, in addition to that, also enhancing the overall safety standards that are in place. And the really big element is to actually now hold individuals or individual organizations to account. And it basically that ushering in of an era of accountability, as the original housing minister, I think number 10 going backwards, really making sure that there is somebody on the hook. We are holding somebody to account, be it within the development process, within the design process, the contractors, the owners, and property managers as well. And the whole process is looking to try and change the culture of the industry, again, from design, construction to management as well. And the reason why that is happening is because that's what Dame Judith Hackett, in her report, A Brighter Future, really focused in on the fact that actually we've got an incredibly poor culture in design, construction, and management of buildings. Central to the whole of this process is risk assessment, and really importantly to have effective risk assessment. And in the past we have had a number of issues. We've got conflicting advice and recommendation from different enforcing agencies, fire and rescue services versus the Building Safety Regulator. And I'm going to discuss those particular conflicts or potential conflicts later on in the presentation. But also, in addition, and again, this has come from Dame Judith's findings, there's always been a race to the bottom. Quite obviously and understandably, people want to make sure they get the best value for money. But more often than not, we're seeing potential issues in respect of fire risk assessments. When we actually, for example, was reading a fire risk assessment from a consultant who had undertaken the common areas of a residential block, which actually stated that there was no sleeping risk in that building, when clearly just because he was doing the common areas doesn't mean that there is no sleeping risk in that building. And that's really what we're looking to actually deal with here. And that's with changing culture and changing climate in residential risk assessments. We're trying to move away from having a risk assessment that really just tries to hand off issues onto other persons, to actually saying this has got to consider the whole building. Okay. The reason why we are talking about risk assessments, it comes down effectively to the Building Safety Act and Section 156. Now, most people would assume that the Building Safety Act itself only covers higher risk buildings. Well, actually, Section 156 actually amends the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, otherwise we'll call it from now on the Fire Safety Order. And the actual section itself came into force in the 1st of October 2023. So it's been in force now for almost 8 or 9 months. Now, what the actual section did, amended the actual Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, but effectively stated that this isn't just about changes to fire risk assessment in residential accommodation. You've got to consider fire risk assessments and the changes following to the FSO for commercial, retail, industrial, and any other workplace that is covered by the fire safety order itself. So we are not just talking about residential blocks here. It is all types of buildings. But Section 156 has had a significant change and impact on the whole approach to fire risk assessment. Okay, so Peter was talking to you about cultural change and the change in culture. And what I just want to quickly do is take you through where that change is manifesting itself and where the government are actually aiming there, or at least the previous government. We're waiting for to find out how the new government will deal with this. But the previous government were really trying to focus and change culture in a number of different ways. First things first, there's a change in regulatory climate. So the regulatory focus is very much now on 2 particular areas to make sure that the construction and construction product arrangements that we have in place are fit for purpose. But importantly, it's also to change and focus on that era of accountability. We were at a meeting this morning where we were discussing accountability with one particular organization. And it's very clear that they understood the fact that actually, do you know what? I can delegate my accountability, but I cannot get rid of it. I cannot transfer it to somebody else. I hold the accountability at the end of the day. I might ask a managing agent to take on some of my responsibilities, but actually I hold that accountability. And that is a significant change in the way that people perceive risk and perceive buildings. A lot of people have taken on buildings and passed them over to managing agents and just left it with them to manage safety. In respect of higher risk buildings, that approach is no longer acceptable. There is also a change in expectations on individuals and corporate entities. The corporate entities now, certainly from post-Grenfell, it's very much the focus. They are the principal accountable persons or accountable persons. But there is a understanding that if an individual within that organization either is connives or is neglectful, then they also have a degree of personal accountability that can be called out by the regulator and by the CPS. So there's a very clear change in the way that corporate entities have to consider risk and manage risk in the much wider environment. There is now increased information, increased clarity and detail that's now required within risk assessments. They are no longer just being used for one purpose, the fire safety order. Risk assessments are being used for lots and lots of different purposes to support safety case reports, etc. And I think there's now a recognition as well that there is a need to consider these as living, breathing documents, that just because you have a risk assessment that was undertaken on the 1st of January 2024 doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stay that way. Buildings change, occupancies change, occupants change, management systems change, the law changes, and we are in a time when law is changing significantly. So they are living documents. And the other element as well on corporate entities, it's all about competence. It's being able to prove that the person who is managing risk, the person who is assessing risk, is competent to do so. And again, that change in culture is going to lead to what we believe, or we understand, is new regulation, certainly in the next 3 to 4 months, and new guidance in respect of competence. Finally, then, in respect to the changing culture, there is a change in enforcement. A lot of the enforcement tools that were available prior to the new regime being enforced or put into place were hardly used. They were scarcely used because they were incredibly difficult to prove in certain circumstances. Now what we have is very clear enforcement approaches and tools and an arsenal of different approaches that the different regulators can use. There are higher fines for getting it wrong, and in this instance, if it's a Building Safety Act issue, then there is the potential for jail sentences as well. Okay, so how did we get to where we are now? I could take you back to obviously June 2017 when we actually had Grenfell, but actually if you go through the history of this process, it goes back much further than that. But legally, we got here based on a series of 3 steps. So in 2021, we had the Fire Safety Act. And the Fire Safety Act effectively tinkered around with the scope of the fire safety order. And it basically applied certain requirements to say that in a residential block, the areas that need to be covered by a fire risk assessment are the building structure, the external walls, and any common parts as well. And those external walls had to include doors and windows and anything attached to the external wall, such as balconies, brise-soleils, cladding, etc. In addition, the fire risk assessment was extended to include all of the doors and fire doors within a building between the domestic premises and the common parts, and those doors within the common parts. So effectively, after the introduction of that particular act, there was really a need for you to review or update your fire risk assessment. Well, following that and following the phase 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which, by the way, we are waiting September the 18th for the next phase. So there is a possibility that additional regulation may come out of that next phase of the inquiry. But the phase 1 report produced and set out the fact that all occupied residential buildings with 2 or more sets of domestic dwellings had to have clear instructions delivered to residents so they could really understand them, and actually also provide them with information about the fire doors, not just how to use a fire door, but why fire doors are so important. It also suggested that for buildings in excess of 11 metres, that they should carry out checks of flat entrance doors and quarterly checks of all of the fire doors in the common parts of that building. And then for buildings that were in excess of 18 metres, i.e. the buildings that are now within the scope of the Building Safety Act, there was additional requirement to provide building plans, details of the exterior walls to the local fire and rescue service, as well as undertaking checks of your lifts and other key equipment, providing what's called a secure information box, or a girder box as some may call it, and also to ensure that wayfinding signage was actually installed on a retrospective basis. The reason being was that the building regulations, which requires wayfinding signage, cannot be applied retrospectively. So this was a retrospective requirement. And again, following the introduction of that, people should really have thought about reviewing their risk assessments again. And then we come to the 1st of October last year and the introduction of the Section 156, or the implementation of Section 156 of the Building Safety Act 2022. Again, this one amended the fire safety order again, but specifically looked at fire risk assessments. And those risk assessments, as I say, applied to all types of buildings, not just residential. And effectively, previously to this, the fire safety order used to talk about the fact that you had to detail the substantive risks in your assessment. Well, that is no longer acceptable. We now need to consider all of the risks and detail them in full. We've got to include a lot more detail about the actual risks themselves. We can't just make blanket statements that fire doors are in place. We've got to provide and ascertain and detail the what, the why, and the where. We've also got to remember that if you are a departing responsible person, so someone who is no longer managing a particular building, there is a duty now to share information with the new responsible person. So often, Peter and I will be talking to clients and we'll be saying to them, okay, so what information were you provided by the previous agent? And they'd say, nothing. We got the building as it is. That is no longer an acceptable process. Risk management information has got to be provided and shared between responsible person to responsible person. It's a legal requirement now. And in addition to that, the responsible persons, over and above the information they're providing under the Fire Safety England regulations, have got to provide more information to residents regarding fire safety information, such as means of escape layouts, equipment, and how they should not be using that equipment unless they are trained, etc. So we've got to a position now where we have got a completely different regime and a completely different approach. But actually, we've now got a little bit of a problem. The problem is that we've got two regimes. We've got the Fire Safety Order regime and we've got the Building Safety Act regime. And in addition to that, we've got two different enforcement bodies. So the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 is actually enforced by the local fire and rescue service. And it basically requires that responsible persons, who are normally managing agents, plus other commercial tenants as well, to undertake risk assessment and for the areas for which they are responsible for. So if we're a managing agent on behalf of the client, they would generally look at the common areas. And that's a perfectly acceptable coverage. A type 1 fire risk assessment, for example, is perfectly acceptable if we are meeting the requirements of the fire safety order. I say that because we've often seen as well that some fire and rescue services are actually saying, look, we don't believe that it is suitable and sufficient in this instance just to look at the common areas. And we are seeing some fire and rescue authorities actually saying, do you know what, we're looking for a type 3 or a type 4 assessment. And they're actually delivering that requirement through an enforcement notice. It is rare, but it is becoming more prevalent as we go through this whole process. So that's one side of the regime. We've got a new side, which obviously only applies to higher risk buildings. So buildings over 18 meters containing 2 residential apartments or student accommodation. And that is enforced, the Building Safety Act 2022, and all of the secondary legislation that sits behind that is enforced by the Building Safety Regulator. Now, they sit within the Health and Safety Executive. And in this instance, we're not interested in responsible persons. We're interested in what we call accountable persons. And then that's normally the owners and not the managing agents. And the guidance and the recommendation from the Building Safety Regulator is that you should be looking at a whole building approach. So we're looking at a type 3 or type 4 fire risk assessment that would be acceptable rather than the type 1. And we've got to include the tenants demised areas. And those tenants demised areas, we're not suggesting every single residential apartment, but certainly we should be looking at a sample of the tenants themselves, but also include the commercial tenants. And it's really interesting that we look at those commercial tenants specifically for the types of risks that they pose to the building. For example, we were looking at a risk assessment for a particular type of building, a particular residential block, 12 stories, which had a number of commercial units on the ground floor, one of which was a hardware store, which normally would be seen as, okay, relatively medium, low to medium risk. But actually at the back of that store, they were storing something in the region of 60 10-kilogram bottles of butane gas. Butane gas is not going to be contained within any force field. It's going to have a major impact on the whole building if there was going to be an incident. So it's really important that we look at the whole building if we are going to consider the whole building's risk. And that is really where the regulator is sitting. So 2 regimes, 2 different requirements. If you are under the Regulator Reform Fire Safety Order, it's very likely that a Type 1 assessment is going to be perfectly acceptable looking at the common areas. That being said, as I said, the fire authorities are slowly kicking that around. And then we've got the Building Safety Regulator under the Building Safety Act, who is really focused on the whole building. Okay, 2 regimes, 2 types of assessment. So what is going to be considered the most suitable and sufficient? And that's actually what the terminology is actually used within the fire safety order. It is your responsibility to ensure that your fire risk assessment is suitable and sufficient, taking into consideration the risks. So the regulator's view, and as I said, the regulator sits within the Health and Safety Executive, is that actually, do you know what? We have a problem. There is no definition of the term suitable and sufficient in the fire safety order. So what the regulator has done has actually come up with their own definition, suggesting that in order for a fire risk assessment to be suitable and sufficient, it needs to meet a number of criteria. It should ensure that it is a full and proper check of the whole property, i.e. it should have sufficient coverage. It should also provide full and detailed justification, providing commentary rather than just a tick box. It's perfectly acceptable to have a tick box as long as there is commentary. That commentary has got to justify the acceptance or not of the issues that they are raising or discussing at that time. You've got to describe the evidence that's there. It's all about proving it effectively. And it's got to start thinking about all of the risks that are posed by all of the residents themselves. Again, especially things such as commercial. They have a major impact on residential blocks and others as well. It's got to have a full technical consideration. You can't just consider the equipment that's only contained within your area. So we need to understand, for example, if there is a fire alarm system within a tenant's demise, whether it's an LD system, it's independent, or whether it is actually attached or fed by the main system. We need to understand what type of systems are in place throughout the whole of the building and how they interact with each other. And in addition, where possible, you should include those who are affected by the risks in the process. Now, that's really simple to write, simple to say, incredibly difficult. But under the new regime, especially under the Building Safety Act, we've got a bigger focus now on residents' engagement. And resident engagement will now include sharing information relating to fire risk and taking the views of residents into account when actually dealing with the whole process. So suitable and sufficiency, that is where we're looking at in respect of the regulator. And finally, they're saying that we need to consider all of the risks, taking into consideration the number of people who may be affected. So again, it comes back to sufficient coverage, ensuring that we are considering all areas of the building rather than just the common areas. So that's the regulator's view. But as I said, the regulator is focusing on one side of the regime. But at least we've now got a definition of what suitable and sufficient really needs or actually means. Let's talk about then suitable and sufficient when we come to section 156, because section 156 doesn't really matter about where it is or where it's situated within the building or what type of building. Basically, it says that section 156 basically requires that you need to take reasonable steps to ascertain who are the other responsible persons. It's not just going to be an owner and a managing agent. Other responsible persons are going to include, for example, commercial tenants, if that's the case. Anyone else who shares a duty under the regulator reform fire safety order, then that effectively means that we need to be able to detail who they are and also outline exactly where they are and who and how you can contact them. In addition, section 156 talks about the fact that you've got to also include details of any accountable persons or principal accountable persons. And we've got to identify those and make sure that they are involved in the process. We have again got to be able to share all of the relevant fire safety information with incoming responsible persons if they are departing, and provide residents with relevant fire safety information in a format that is easily understood by the residents. And that is an interesting approach, because the regulation is now trying to actually be and ensure that the use of jargon, the use of technical language is cut down, especially when we are talking to residents. We've got to make sure that residents can easily understand that document. And that also refers to information such as the information that you're providing through the Fire Safety England regulations. The last thing I just really wanted to talk about is the fact that the high risk keeping and sharing of information regulations also states that an accountable person or principal accountable persons must provide residents and other relevant persons with a summary of the findings of the fire risk assessment. So again, it's sharing that information. You don't have to provide a full version of the fire risk assessment unless the resident asks for it. But in any case, you must be providing now a summary of the findings. So your fire risk assessment really ought to include that summary that you should be able to extract from the assessment and hand that out to all relevant persons, residents, owners of flats, etc. So what does that actually mean for the types of assessments and approaches that are taken? What we have looked at here is just some typical ways that in the past assessors might have gone about describing particular things that are happening within your particular building. For example, they may state that there is vertical mechanical smoke extracts or AOVs are installed. Well, that's great news. But actually, under the new approach, that is going to be insufficient in itself. The amended fire safety order now needs you to explain what type of ventilation system it is, where is it, what is it doing, what is it covering, is it satisfactory, and why is it satisfactory? It's the who, what, where. That is really important. That's about justifying the safety systems that are in place. Same again in respect to someone putting a little bit more information in there, saying that the fire alarm and detection system installed covers the common areas only and is in line with BS 5839 Part 1. Great. But again, under the amendments, we now need to be more specific and provide more detail. Exactly what type is it? Is it detection? Is it alarm? Is it both? What's it designed to do? What is it activating? Why is it satisfactory? And same in respect to things such as fire doors. If fire doors were noted to be satisfactory, that's really good. But we need to understand, how did we actually determine that they were satisfactory? What and who are they protecting? So justification in fire risk assessments now isn't just about ticking the box and just leaving it at that. We need to be able to, if we're going to have boxes ticked, tick those boxes and provide some further information, provide some further justification. commentary is now key when it comes to actually determine the effectiveness of a fire risk assessment. Okay. Very, very quickly want to talk about safety case reports and the role of type 3 in FRAs in safety case reports. And I'm going to go through the types and outline them in a bit more detail in a few seconds. But under the guidance that's been issued by the Home Office and the Building Safety Regulator, they've made it very, very clear. And I'm just going to put these all up just because it's a lot easier to actually detail. And every time they're talking about risk assessment, which, as I said, is the key now to building safety, they always are looking for a consideration of the whole building. In some instances, they've actually turned around and said it's actually vital that your fire risk assessment covers the whole building approach, because we need to start thinking about buildings as systems, as a collection of control measures, a collection of protective measures that are actually put in place. And therefore, if you are using your fire risk assessment to support your safety case report, the advice that we certainly would give is that you really do need to consider a type 3 fire risk assessment. A type 1 fire risk assessment that only covers the common areas is going to be a major issue. Peter mentioned that there are some statistics out there. There's about last year in high risk buildings alone, and I can only talk about high risk buildings because that's the figures I've got, there were 9,420 fires in those types of buildings. So those 9,420 fires in higher risk buildings in England alone. Less than 40 of those actually were in or started in the common areas. The vast majority were in flats, were in the actual individual units themselves. And that is why the regulator is so focused on a whole building approach. That is why Dame Judith herself said that we've got to move away from being and working in a very siloed approach to looking at the whole building, to looking at a much more holistic manner. And that's really where we would recommend that those who are affected by the Building Safety Act, those of you who are using your fire risk assessments to support your safety case report, need to focus on that particular part. So I'm going to very quickly go through this particular part because most people will know the different types of assessment. Just to let you know that we are awaiting a new British standard, and that will have new definitions in respect of the types of assessment. That being said, those definitions are they're minor changes. They sets out in principle those 4 different types of assessment, and they differ basically depending upon the parts of which the building is inspected and the use of intrusive techniques. So a type 1 assessment looks at the common areas on a non-intrusive basis. A type 2, though, will look at exactly the same number of areas, common areas only, but in a more intrusive nature, generally looking at the walls between the common areas and the flats themselves. A type 3 FRA looks at the common areas and some of the demised areas on a sample basis, but is undertaken in a non-intrusive nature, whereas a type 4 does exactly the same in respect of coverage, but is actually more intrusive. I just really wanted to mention one thing as well, that these types of risk assessment only apply to residential buildings. They don't actually apply to commercial or any other types of buildings. There's just a fire risk assessment that affects the commercial building. So very, very quickly then, and I will whiz through this particular part because I want to move on to the the principles, because that's the important part now. Is a type 1 fire risk assessment is a very basic assessment. Is designed to meet the purpose of satisfying the fire safety order if you are responsible for the common areas. It covers the common areas only, the means of escape, plant rooms, risers, shared areas, parks, car parks and lounges. It's non-intrusive in nature, but the recommendations are that it should include a sample of the flat entrance doors and a sample of the riser cupboards. It should include, where it is possible, access to the roof voids, if it's safe to do so. It should consider the separation between the common areas and the residential demises, but without any intrusive works, and it must include consideration of the exterior wall and any attachments. That's a type 1, typical, that would be acceptable by the fire safety and fire rescue services. A type 2 risk assessment is generally a one-off exercise. It's very similar to a type 1 assessment, but it does include a degree of intrusive inspection. It covers the common areas only, but as I said, it does open up the construction between the common areas and the residential demises themselves. Now, a type 3 assessment, the one there, certainly we are recommending to clients, especially if you have a residential block that is a higher risk building. It's a whole building consideration. It's in line, therefore, with the guidance from the Building Safety Regulator. It covers the common areas and a sample of the dwellings. 10% sample is normally acceptable. You can have less if it's a much bigger building. It's non-intrusive in nature, but again, includes a sample of the flats, includes the roof voids, includes the separation of the construction between the common areas and the apartments themselves, and of course, it includes the external wall and attachments. Now, we often get asked by clients, well, aren't we therefore taking on the risk from the residents themselves? No, you're not. The lawyers are telling us that that's not the case, and in fact, the guidance that's out there says effectively that what you should be considering when you're actually undertaking a type 3 assessment, because it's all done via a visual inspection, is not how or if certain things are actually happening, but is the integrity of the fire resisting elements there? So we have no obvious holes, that the travel distances within the flats are perfectly acceptable, that the protection, if there are hallways, is where it needs to be, that the door itself can open easily, that if we've got inner rooms, that they are actually well protected as well, that we also need to consider if we've got masonettes, or duplexes, that the upper levels have got appropriate means of escape, that we're actually looking to make sure that smoke and heat detectors are there, or sprinkler systems are there, and anything that is installed by the duty holder, such as electrical and heating installations, are well maintained. Nothing, though, that if it is installed or managed or responsibility of the tenants themselves, then the fire risk assessment should include those particular parts. The last one, the type 4 fire risk assessment, literally is a whole building. It's a very unusual approach. We wouldn't recommend it for every particular building. It is useful in certain parts and certain areas and certain circumstances. It covers, as I said, the whole building plus a sample. There is a degree of intrusivity, a much higher degree of intrusivity. We are not just looking at the differences or the separation between the flats and the common areas, but what about the flats themselves? It's the most comprehensive fire risk assessment that you can actually have. And as I said, it's most often used if there is a reason to suspect that actually we've got some serious risks. So your type 1 or type 3 or even type 2 assessment may have highlighted the fact that we've got some particular problems in this building. Perhaps we ought to be looking at a much more in-depth assessment. And so therefore, it's a very useful tool that can be available for that particular purpose. Okay. Undertaking a fire risk assessment now is obviously clearly a legal requirement, and it's incredibly important. But I think what's also important is how we go about managing those risks that stem from it. I just want to spend a few moments, probably about 5 minutes, detailing with this, and then we can go through the finalisation and any questions that people have. The regulations effectively says, especially in respect of higher risk buildings, that accountable persons have got to prevent building safety risks and reduce the severity of it. It also says that you may have to take steps if, for example, your risk assessment requires you to do so. So that's the first two elements. It's being very clear about how you go about it. And the risk we're talking about here is actually defined within the Act as risk of fire and risk of structural failure as well. The section then has three more particular elements. It says that when you are dealing with the steps, you should do and act in accordance with the prescribed principles, that you should take those steps promptly. There is no definition of prompt, unfortunately. So leaving a risk assessment without any actions for a year, for example, probably not be considered to be dealing with it promptly, and that you should be putting in place an effective safety management system. And it's been very, very clearly set out in the guidance attached to this particular section, and in detail within the actual higher risk buildings management of safety risks regulations, which came out last year. So I want to talk about the principles themselves, and I've no intention of going into too much detail other than to turn around and say that these are actually set out in order. These are effectively providing us with what we call a hierarchy of control. And what the regulations effectively says is that we should be looking to avoid building safety risks in the first place. And if we cannot avoid building safety risks, then we should evaluate those risks that cannot be avoided and identify the proportional measures required to address, reduce, and mitigate and control those risks down to a tolerable level. And that's the important part now. Rather than just leaving things on, we can reduce that slightly. Actually, we've got to bring things down to a tolerable level. Excuse me. If we can't, and if after we've evaluated those risks, then we may have to look at combating risks at source by introducing other proportional measures to, again, address, reduce, mitigate, or control the risks at the earliest opportunity. And that might, for example, be dealing with things right back relating to things such as the actual fire alarm system and making sure that the fire alarm system is as effective and as appropriate as necessary. We should therefore also be providing suitable and proportional systems. So the equipment that we put in place, all of the plant and services that we have should be in place, but therefore monitored, managed, maintained effectively. So inspected, tested and maintained to ensure that they work and are sufficient. And then the other element is that, and this is the important part, where we need to be dealing with collective protective measures. We should be looking at all of the protective measures rather than individual measures themselves. There's been a lot of noise about a thing called the introduction of 2 staircase requirements for brand new buildings. And actually, when you look back at this is not just about how many staircases you've got. It's about the systems, the protection, the arrangements, and the management of risk that's an important part here. Those prescribed principles then go on. They talk about the fact that we need to adapt to technical progress, that we need to, where reasonably possible, replace the dangerous with the non-dangerous or less dangerous, that we consider the impacts on residents and carry out engagement, which is a standard now approach within the building safety regime, and that we should be giving people instructions and information on working within the building, on understanding risk as well. And the final element of the prescribed principles deals with making sure that we've got relevant competence. And I've got one slide here that just talks about the fact that relevant competence has to be considered on 2 bases. If we're talking about an individual, then we're looking at the skills, knowledge, and the experience that that person has in order to be able to perform their function and to deliver the actual assessment in a satisfactory manner. Where that person is not an individual, then we need to make sure that there is organizational capability to, again, make sure that it's working. But again, if individuals are in training, then they can be adequately supervised by a person who has the relevant competence. So again, the prescribed principles shouldn't be considered in isolation. They are looking to provide layers of protection. We've got to consider risk now rather as individual elements, but in a holistic manner, that we've got to consider numerous protective and preventative barriers. Again, it is not just about one layer. And The government have made it very, very clear. They want people to stop relying upon short-term, old-fashioned, outdated approaches. To use the terminology in the guidance, the government are saying that, for example, waking watch is short-term. It is a system that we should not be using. We should be looking at other protective barriers and measures to make sure that persons who are living in those buildings are safe. I'm very conscious of time. I just want to quickly go through very quickly how those prescribed principles work in actual in real life. If you can imagine a hazard that's inside a fire, we're going to have numerous safety features. We're not going to be having one safety feature. You're going to have compartment walls, which include fire doors. We're going to have, hopefully, fire detection and or alarm systems. We might even have fire suppression systems. All of those measures are safety features, but those safety features need to be maintained, need to be tested. We also need to make sure that if those fail, that we are able to get people out of that building by having safe means of escape routes. It is a collection of protective measures. It is not one set of safety measures now. So when you look at your fire risk assessments now, you should be looking at them in a much wider, more holistic approach. As I said, those principles are ordered from the most to the least effective. They are there to interact with each other. They are, as I said, all mutually supportive. For example, a safety feature that combats a risk at source may also provide collective safety and will also need to be tested and maintained over a period of time if they are going to remain effective. And again, just to use the terminology that's come directly from the government, that relying upon a single prevention or mitigation measure will not provide the multiple layers of protection that they are expecting or is necessary. So, last part then, before we answer any of your questions, is that increased liability to organisations is a very clear consequence of the new regime. There is a much higher risk of higher fines and also possible imprisonment for safety breaches. So, for example, a breach of the fire safety order now is punishable, for example, not having a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. It's punishable by an unlimited fine. Whereas a breach of the Building Safety Act is not only punishable by an unlimited fine, but up to 2 years imprisonment. And then just to cap it off, there is the possibility that there is personal liability if a director, a manager, for example, either consents, connives, or is neglectful. Then they as well have or hold a degree of personal liability. So we promised 3 things about the changing climate in residential fire risk assessments. Here they are. First things first, we have a new regime with new requirements and a new approach. Things have changed. Things are going to change even more over the next few years. Section 156 has had a major impact on the way that we do things, on coverage, content and style of your fire risk assessments. And by the way, it doesn't just affect residential blocks. The level of detail, therefore, that's in your fire risk assessment has got to be greater than it was in the past. We've got to cover the what, the where, the why, if that fire risk assessment is going to be suitable and sufficient. So we think it's time that people should be reviewing what they have in place and deciding whether actually it's time to re-look at our assessments and redo them. That the type of fire risk assessment that you choose will depend upon what you're using it for. Are you meeting the requirements of the fire safety order, or do you need something that's going to be a whole building approach for the Building Safety Act? And finally, it isn't just about risk assessment. If we just were to focus on risk assessment, we are missing the idea or ideas of the whole of the prescribed principles. It's how we now manage those risks. We cannot do things the way that we used to do so. We have to change to that new holistic approach. And at the end of the day, and we are going to be seeing new laws and new guidance coming up very, very soon, competence is key. Peter, I've gone over a little bit, but hopefully that is sufficient.
It is fabulous. Thank you very much, David. It is a complex subject, and we limit ourselves to this kind of hour, and we try and get as much in there as possible. So I do appreciate that. Interestingly as well, I've seen the kind of the attendance figures, and normally these things you start to get a dip halfway through, and people start to leave. It is actually going up. I think it's genuinely one of those things that people are confused about and people need information on. It's one of those measures that we talk about, one of those collective measures. So we're going to run another poll. So Rhiannon, are you around? Can you facilitate this poll? So this time, what we want to do is, we asked right at the start, we've got a benchmark, and this is more now about, your plans in the future, and as the information kind of sunk in, if we done our job here, that to explain that risk assessments have evolved, and with respect to that, we need to evolve too as property managers. And so over to you, Rhiannon.
Okay, so I've launched the poll now, and your responses are coming in, but I'll just leave it for a minute while everybody submits their answers. Interestingly, there seems to be a much higher percentage of people voting on the third option. Just give it a few seconds. Still a couple answers coming in.
They're still coming in, but I think it's an amazing. It's kind of what we wanted to see. I think for us at ARC, as I started the preamble, if you like, I was talking about our knowledge and our place in the industry and the information that we have, and for us, there's nothing more important than the safety of the people in the buildings that we look after, and I know that you look after too, and I know that our clients share that feeling with us. So this is really encouraging. It's lovely to see that those days we are evolving, and those days of that kind of those days are gone now. That kind of that quick fly around a building risk assessment. We need we need those details now. And credit to the government and the lawmakers that brought this in, because Section 156 is powerful. Section 156, I think, is for us. I know for David and myself, we talked about this when we were looking at the Building Safety Bill as it was then, and we were super excited about the thought that the things that we've been talking about for so long are finally coming to fruition. I can't see any questions. Rhiannon, can you see any questions? We've got a couple of minutes, and I'm sure we can stay on for a little bit longer if people want to ask some questions. You've also got our details, and you know who we are in case questions come to you at a later date. But is there anything coming in, Rhiannon?
But we'll give everybody a couple minutes to see if any
it's
come
one of the
in.
things we've either done a really good job or a really bad job. So, we've helped people to kind of understand that there's a huge change. There's an awful lot of information, I think, that we've passed on in a very short space of time as well. So if there are no questions, I'm going to take that as a positive. And I think, looking at the people on the call, I think you know who we are, and we are very accessible as an organisation. No question is too small for us to answer, and to give support in any way we can is what we're really here for. So we're just coming up to the 1 hour mark. We started bang on time. I reckon credit to David Hills. I think we're going to finish just bang on time. If no one's going to come in with a question right at the last minute. So just for me to say thank you so much. Thank you, Rhiannon, for facilitating it. And there we go. Always the way, with 30 seconds remaining. I think a question came in or a hand went up. Maybe not.
There's a couple questions. There's a couple questions coming now.
Let's see what we can do, because I'm very happy to kind of stay a little bit and answer. So let's see what we've got.
Someone's asked if there's going to be a copy or summary of the slides. Yes, there will be a recording, and a copy of the slides can be sent out to you after this. So that's all fine. So someone has asked, what if HRB has compartmentation issues? Would type 1 be sufficient?
I would suggest no.
No.
It's a HRB, and therefore we need to be considering the whole building. And when we talk about whole building, I would suggest, and the recommendation from ARC would be, go for a Type 3 assessment. That Type 3 assessment may pick up sufficient detail and information relating to the compartmentation. It may be that it recommends a separate specific compartmentation survey, but just having a Type 1 assessment in a HRB nowadays would not be suitable and sufficient because it's not dealing with the whole building. Again, that's not me saying it, it's the actual regulator in their documentation that's saying this. So it could be that a Type 4 assessment may be better for you. But again, always look to see what information you've got that supports a Type 3 assessment in the first place. It could be that you have already sufficient detail relating to the compartmentation. If, though, you are aware of compartmentation issues already, my strong advice is go for a compartmentation survey. If you are very clear and are aware of problems, deal with that at source. As I said, combat the risk at source, and take it and focus on the compartmentation for that particular part.
And also I'll just add to that as well, don't forget that compartmentation or the veracity of passive fire protection within the building becomes more important depending on the type of evacuation strategy there. So if that evacuation strategy is defending place, then that compartmentation is key. If we have a simultaneous or a phased evacuation, it's less critical, but it is critical. Just one of the things I want to quickly point out about that as well when we're talking about those different types. And one of the graphics David shared earlier on, one of the series of graphics, we had essentially a 3D floor plan of a building, and highlighted in the middle in red was a small area which was the common parts, and the outer area in grey was the apartments, if you like. That was Grenfell Tower. And I think one of the startling things about that image is that fire risk assessment looked at this tiny element, this tiny square in the middle of the building. That's not where things went wrong. Essentially, things went wrong, as David said earlier on as well, that tiny percentage of things that go wrong in the common parts. If we were going to, think about this logically, and we're going to think logically about the safety of people and buildings, of course we want to be in there. So if the residential and the high rise, I agree with David there, absolutely no, not to a Type 1.
Okay, we've got another question here. Do FRAs need to be sent to residents?
Okay, so if it's a HRB, then you must by law provide a resident with a summary of your fire risk assessment. If, though, a resident or an owner of a flat requests in writing to you, or however you have decided through your resident engagement strategy to accept requests, and they've requested a copy of the fire risk assessment, then they must be provided within a reasonable period of time a full version of that assessment.
Well, just add to that as well. One of the things that you mentioned there is that that resident request, the resident's voice. If it's not apparent to you now, it will become apparent over the next weeks, months, and years. The resident's voice is louder and louder and louder, and it's in the ear of the regulator. So, absolutely, they should get a summary. Now, at ARC's fire risk assessments, we're just kind of moving to a new system, and we took this into account. So we've kind of got an executive summary or a kind of resident summary page that could be published and shared with a resident. But quite rightly, if they request the full document, now fire risk assessments aren't written for these people, so a lot of the documentation we write is for a different audience. But it's one of the things that we've considered now when we're writing fire risk assessments is that audience has changed as well. So we need to be part of that culture change. We need to understand that people are genuinely interested in the fire risks and the assessment of fire risks within the buildings that they live in. I think that they're right to do so too. So yes, that's changing. That resident voice is getting louder and louder and louder.
There's another question quite similar to that, but they've asked how detailed or brief should the summary of the FRA be to the residents?
There is no guidance. You need to provide a summary using language that is easily understood by a common person. Again, there is no guidance on that. I would suggest a very simple 1 or 2 page summary that outlines what type of risks are in place, what control measures are in place, because it's always good to point out what systems you have that are protecting people and how they can protect themselves, as well as what has gone wrong, and very importantly, what you are doing about those particular elements. So again, that's the type of thing we would recommend is included within an executive summary.
Another one here. We recently prepared a building safety case on a 19-floor building. The provider supplied a type 1 assessment in support of this. Will this be rejected?
We don't know. Very likely, the regulator will pose questions. Very likely, because the regulator has, we've spoken to the regulator, we've had meetings with the regulator, and the regulator has made it very clear that it's highly probable that they will pose questions and question why a particular type of assessment is in place if it doesn't include the tenant's demised areas. Type 1s do not cover that area. So I would strongly suggest that it may not be rejected, but there may be questions that are asked.
And those questions, it's worth pointing out, well, those questions that might be asked, they're going to need to understand some things that the fire risk assessment isn't quite telling them. So there's going to be a two-way conversation here between the regulator and the principal accountable person. Let's think of those minutes that are racking up in those conversations, pound notes, because that is the language that a lot of the PAPs are talking about now. How much is this going to cost? The more information you provide in a safety case report, the less likely those conversations are going to be long. And what we would try and do, what we certainly try to do at ARC, is limit that conversation. So we give absolutely all the information we need to make a justifiable case for safety of that building, and to cut down on that. But almost certainly the regulator is going to be wanting to talk about, well, what's inside the apartments. If we haven't got a clear picture of that from a risk assessment in an HRB, we're probably going to be having questions asked of us. I agree.
So got two more questions. How would you incorporate FRAs in the existing format into the guidance on the building safety risk assessment?
I don't think you can use existing formats because the regulations have changed. There is a need to add more detail. So if you didn't have that detail in the first place, as I said, tick boxes are fine. There's a lot of people who turn around and say, we should never use a tick box. We've never, ever said that. Tick boxes are fine if you provide sufficient commentary, justification, and detail as to why you said that something is acceptable. And that is the really important part now. It's the level of detail that has to go into the assessment. And in addition, you cannot just assume certain things are satisfactory. We use a terminology in our business called swappy, which means so what and prove it. And that's really what people need to be thinking about now. How do I prove that the assessment is satisfactory and that the particular system is satisfactory for what it's designed to do? So I don't think you're going to say, we could turn around and say that, oh, how do we incorporate an existing approach? Things have got to change because the law has changed.
Okay, last question. Does the FRA under the FSO get sent to the BSR, or is it up to the BSR to inquire?
It's up to the BSR to inquire, and the BSR will only look at that assessment if it is a higher risk building. And so that's the only time that particular part will actually occur. If the regulator requests a copy of it, and we would expect, and they have effectively told us that that's probably what they're going to be asking for, more than likely, if the safety case report doesn't give them sufficient detail and sufficient comfort that the actual risks have been justified fully for that safety case report.
Fabulous. Thank you, David. Thank you, Rhiannon. And thanks to everybody that's joined this webinar and is still on this webinar. Incredible. Questions may arise after this. That's always the way. There's an awful lot of information to process. ARC are here. We're not going anywhere, so please feel free to reach out and contact us if you've got any queries or questions that we can support with. We're very happy to do that, always happy to do that. So my final thing is a word of thanks really for Rhiannon, to David, and to all the attendees. Thank you so much. Recording and slides will be available in due course. Thank you, everybody.